Constitution and this hearing on the Restoring the Voting Rights Act, Protecting the Native American and Alaskan Native Vote will come to order. Although the ranking member is not here right now, our colleague, Senator Lujan, has another commitment. I'm just going to give him the opportunity to provide his testimony to the subcommittee, make a record, and I want to thank him for being here. And then if the ranking member isn't here by the time we have to proceed, we'll take a short recess. But we really appreciate your being here. Senator Lujan, you are one of the most expert of our colleagues on the topics we're going to discuss today. And thank you so much for your insights and perspective. Please proceed.
Chairman Blumenthal, I want to thank you and also to our ranking member, Mr. Cruz, as well, for allowing me to speak before the committee. Thank you for holding this important hearing today in the subcommittee on the importance of protecting Native American voting rights and shining a light on the unique barriers our Native American brothers and sisters face in accessing the ballot box. The sacred right to vote is a fundamental right, and I'm grateful for the subcommittee's attention to this important issue. I also want to recognize President Nez and First Lady Cecilia Nez of the Navajo Nation, who are here today to also testify, and very proud to say the Navajo Nation has also endorsed this legislation. But I'm here today to help honor and introduce Jacqueline De Leon, an enrolled member of Isleta Pueblo in New Mexico and staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund. Ms. De Leon, a longtime champion for Native voting rights, played a vital role in shaping and developing the Native American Voting Rights Act, and I'm thankful for her leadership and expertise, which helped make the legislation and the movement what it is today. Supporters of the Native American Voting Rights Act know that our democracy is at its strongest when every American can participate and make their voice heard. But in too many communities across our nation, voter suppression efforts are making it harder for Americans to vote, especially for Native Americans who continue to experience geographic, linguistic, and legal barriers. That's why I introduced the Native American Voting Rights Act with the support of Chair Blumenthal and Chair Durbin. And I was honored to secure this legislation's inclusion in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021 with the support of Senator Leahy. At the last minority and political group to be afforded the right to vote in the United States, Native Americans have had to consistently fight for access to the ballot box. I'm proud to lead legislation that is part of this civil rights legacy and would bring long overdue progress to protecting voting rights that Native Americans and tribal nations have worked so hard to secure and defend. Our democracy is at stake. This is our moral imperative to protect the right to have their voices heard in our electoral process and to combat barriers that continue to keep Native voters from registering and casting their votes. The Native American Voting Rights Act would ensure that there are early voting, registration, drop boxes, and polling sites on tribal lands and permit tribal governments to designate tribal buildings for these purposes. It would also require states and precincts to accept tribal IDs as valid forms of voter identification and require tribal consultation, notice, and consent before states and precincts make changes that reduce access to the ballot on tribal lands. This bill would also create a $10 million grant program to help states establish a Native American voting rights task force like the one we have in New Mexico to increase consideration among state, local, and tribal governments to increase voter access. Passing this legislation is the right thing to do. And I thank this subcommittee for its attention to ensure voters on tribal lands can participate in the democratic process and tribal nations can have a greater role in securing and protecting that right. I look forward to Ms. De Leon's testimony, as well as other witnesses who will share their stories and discuss the importance and urgency of protecting Native voting rights by removing the unique barriers they face in accessing the ballot box. Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for allowing me to testify today and provide some remarks. I want to thank you and the committee staff, our ranking member, for the work you're doing, and I look forward to the adoption and passage of this legislation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Lujan. And thank you for your very hard and excellent work on the measure that you're introducing today. I'm proud to be a supporter and co-sponsor. I think it will make a huge difference, and I'll be discussing it further in my opening remarks. I'll wait to give those remarks until Senator Cruz arrives. But thank you very much for being here. We'll let you go because I know you have a bunch of other commitments, and everybody here ought to understand that we all have to be in 5 places at the same time. So thank you for being here. Welcome again to everyone. Apologize for the delay. We just finished a vote, and I will give my opening statement. We're going to turn to the ranking member, then Senator Klobuchar, if she's available remotely or here, has some opening remarks, and then we'll turn to the witnesses. We really appreciate your being here. I know many of you have come from a pretty far distance, and particularly in the age of the pandemic, we really are grateful for your participation personally. This subcommittee hearing is our third in considering voting rights, and it is actually the fifth hearing of the Judiciary Committee on this very critically important issue. Today, our focus is on the challenges faced by Native American and Alaska Native voters. These voters have been systematically and purposefully denied participation in the franchise over the history of our country. Some of these obstacles are created by geography and physical distance. For example, many of the Native American voters in Western states face hundreds of miles of travel. In the case of the Duckwater Reservation in Nevada, for example, voters have to travel 140 miles to reach the nearest election polling places. In Alaska, some of the residents of the Aleutian Islands have to travel literally 1,000 miles. And today, as a result, 1 million eligible Native American voters are not registered. That's 1 million Native American individuals are not registered to vote. But the reasons for the lack of registration and the lack of participation are not just geographic or physical, they are also systematically legal barriers that have been created. For example, at the start of the 20th century, state laws prevented Native Americans from voting while they, quote, maintain tribal relations. In other words, if they continue to be members of a Native American tribe, they are barred from voting under then existing laws. These laws permitted Native Americans only who have been assimilated to have the right to vote. In other words, if they continue to, quote, live as members of tribal groups, they have to sever, in effect, sever those relationships. And the laws outright excluded Native Americans from voting under the same rationale that they were, quote unquote, wards of the federal government. The barriers to vote also included the preclusion of tribal ID cards. It held that these tribal ID cards were not an acceptable form of identification for voter registration, but they, of course, are often the only form of ID possessed by Native voters because living on a reservation doesn't require other forms of ID. On reservations, many people lacked traditional mailing addresses or addresses otherwise recognized by the post office. The lack of traditional mailing addresses can result in broad swaths of Indian country being unable to register to vote. The lack of traditional mailing addresses also creates significant obstacles to voting by mail as an alternative. And finally, many states and localities have imposed arbitrary limits on the number of voter registration applications that can be obtained or returned by tribes. In other words, the barriers were not just geographic or physical, but also legal and systematically so. Added to issues like the prevalence of homelessness and housing insecurity, depressed socioeconomic conditions, inadequate resources and funding and redistricting practices designed to marginalize Native voters, along with voter purges and other significant obstacles. The result was and has been systematic denial of rights to vote. And that is why the measure offered by Senator Lujan, he testified about it just minutes ago, the Native American Voting Rights Act, is so very important. And we have included it for the first time in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. That measure is before us now. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act incorporates those vital protections in Senator Lujan's Native American Voting Rights Act. We know from experience as well, and the history shows, that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was extraordinarily successful in providing remedies against these kinds of practices. In 90% of the cases where the act was used, it was successful. Native Americans relied on the Voting Rights Act provision to challenge many of these barriers. And the shredding of the preclearance procedures under Section 2 of that act in the Shelby decision has deprived Native Americans from securing equal access to federal and state elections. So today's hearing is vitally important, and it is important not only to the abstract notion of voting rights for Native Americans and Alaska Natives, it is the practical means of imposing accountability on public officials. We all know on both sides of this dais that ultimately voting rights assure accountability on the part of officials elected to represent and advocate for all of our citizens. Voting rights are widely supported throughout American society on the left, the right, the center. Ideology makes no difference. People support the right to vote. And since its original inception, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 has enjoyed overwhelmingly bipartisan majorities on both houses of Congress. 5 times this measure has been reauthorized with strong bipartisan support. I hope that we can once again be bipartisan in our support for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, incorporating the critical protections of Native American, Alaska Native voters. And I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses today and providing insights and perspective to us as we move forward in this process. I turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate each of the witnesses taking the time to be here today. I have to say, for any political party, when they have power in the Senate, the topics they choose to focus on reflect their priorities. This is, by my count, the 6th hearing either the Senate Judiciary Committee or this subcommittee has held, focused on federalizing elections, focused on what is the Democrats' #1 priority in this Congress, and that is seizing power and ensuring that Democrats stay in power for the next 100 years. It is striking that the Democrats' proposals are not focused on protecting the right to vote, but rather are focused on striking down provisions that prevent voter fraud, striking down provisions that protect the integrity of elections, and instead, what the Democrats are seeking to do is expand voter fraud and disempower the voters from voting Democrats out of office. It is cynical, it is misguided, but it's also transparent. It speaks volumes that that's their priority, despite the fact that there are other pressing topics that we should be addressing, rather than an illegitimate Democratic power grab. And there is no crisis greater within this committee's jurisdiction than the crisis unfolding at our southern border. We are 10 months into the Biden administration. We're 10 months into the disaster at the southern border caused by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. In those 10 months, the Judiciary Committee has held 0 hearings on the chaos on the southern border. In those 10 months, the Judiciary Committee, not interested in hearing about it. It's the Sergeant Schultz defense. I see nothing, I hear nothing. We're on a path for over 2 million people to cross the border illegally this year, the highest rate in 21 years, actually just crossing into the highest rate in 35 years. The Democrats, no hearings. For 4 years under President Trump, we heard every Democrat go on TV talking about kids in cages, kids in cages. And I suppose a reasonable observer might have thought they believed what they were saying. We now know they didn't. Why is that? Because the Biden cages, I've been to the Biden cages. The Biden cages are more full and bigger than they ever have been. And to the best of my knowledge, not a single Democratic member of this Senate has bothered to even go see the kids in cages. They only cared about it when it was an attack on their political opponents and the hundreds of thousands of little boys and little girls locked in cages, getting COVID, being subject to physical and sexual assault by traffickers. The Democrats don't care. The hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants being released across this country, many with COVID. The Democrats don't care. Yesterday, I introduced a bill that might adjust their priorities. It's a bill called the Stop the Surge Act, and it does a very simple thing. It simply creates 13 additional points of entry. One of the reasons the Democrats don't care about the chaos that's unfolding in my state, the state of Texas, is because it's far away. They don't have to see the cages filled with kids. They don't have to see the schools bursting at the seams. They don't have to see the hospitals packed beyond capacity. They don't have to see law enforcement broke and unable to deal with it. It's somebody else's problem. Well, Stop the Surge Act creates 13 additional points of entry in places where Democrats live, including Greenwich, Connecticut, the chairman's home state, but also including places like Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket and Newport, Rhode Island. And it's very easy for Democrats to say, you silly Texans, you silly people in the rest of the country, you shouldn't worry about that. I feel quite confident Senate Democrats would feel differently if each and every week 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 50,000, 100,000 illegal immigrants were being dropped off in Greenwich, Connecticut. Suddenly you would see a cry, this is a crisis. And yet, because it's just Del Rio, Texas, I've been to Del Rio, Texas. To the best of my knowledge, there's not a Democrat in this body that's been to Del Rio, Texas. Del Rio, Texas is a little town, 35,000 people. On one day, there were over 15,000 illegal immigrants, mostly from Haiti, under the bridge in Del Rio, half the population of the city. And Democrats don't care. It is scandalous that we have been nearly a year without a single hearing, without a single Democrat going to the Rio Grande Valley. And instead, what is their priority? Their priority is keeping Democrats in power. Now, this hearing, the sixth one on federalizing elections, in this instance, it's focused on the Native American community. Native American community is a wonderful community across the country of various tribes in each state. It's a community that over history has endured brutality. It's endured discrimination. But in the face of it all, these communities have proved resilient at the same time. I see it in Texas, where we have tribes with reservations like the Alabama Cushada, the Kickapoo, the Isleta del Sur Pueblo. But in Texas and elsewhere across the country, state officials are working with the tribes to meet their voting needs, to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to vote. Wyoming Secretary of State Edward Buchanan is here today. It's good to see you, Mr. Secretary. and I expect that he will tell the committee about this process and how it's already working to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to vote. There's no need for a complete overhaul of voting on tribal lands. But that's what Democrats are pushing, a complete overhaul of voting laws. And yet again, they're doing it for purely partisan gain. The Democrats are hell-bent on undermining voter integrity and rigging the system to favor Democrats. They first tried the most brazen power grab in living memory when they attempted to pass S1, the first bill that was Chuck Schumer's #1 priority, the Corrupt Politicians Act. A bill designed to take powers away from citizens to register millions of illegal aliens, to strike down voter ID laws, to expand ballot harvesting. They tried the same thing in S4. Their next attempt, which would allow radical leftists in the Department of Justice, unappointed bureaucrats, to strike down any voter integrity law they wished, again designed to expand the frequency of voter fraud because, sadly, my Democratic colleagues have made the judgment that the more fraud that occurs, the more it will benefit Democrats. This week, the Senate right now is voting on their revised version of the Corrupt Politicians Act. It's only a little less corrupt. This is the same Democratic operative playbook, complete with ballot harvesting, complete with drop boxes set in the middle of nowhere that invite fraud, and complete with mailing out absentee ballots that voters didn't request. And let's be clear, there used to be consensus that election integrity mattered. There used to be consensus that voter fraud was a bad thing. The last major bipartisan commission to consider voter fraud was the Carter-Baker Commission. It was chaired by former Democratic President Jimmy Carter and former Republican Secretary of State James Baker. Carter-Baker Commission, it's worth rereading what they concluded. It's worth rereading their recommendations because the Carter-Baker Commission concluded voter fraud is real, it is a threat, it undermines the integrity of elections. It recommended, among other things, photo ID for elections to prevent voter fraud. It also listed the practices that contribute to voter fraud, that undermine ballot integrity. One of the principal ones it focuses on was ballot harvesting, the practice of corrupt, paid political operatives collecting the ballots of others, because history has shown that invites fraud and potentially fraud on a wide-scale basis. It focuses on widespread mail-in voting as inviting voter fraud. What is striking about today's Democratic agenda, some 20 years later, it is almost as if they went down the recommendations of the Carter-Baker Commission. How do we prevent voter fraud? And they inverted every recommendation. The only reasonable explanation is they looked at that for a blueprint. How do we get more voter fraud? Let's do the opposite of what the Carter-Baker Commission recommended. And I will point out again, the last I checked, Jimmy Carter was a Democrat. So their notion that being concerned about voter fraud is some crazy right-wing conspiracy is utterly ahistorical. We should protect every American's right to vote. We should protect Native Americans' right to vote. We should protect the right of every American to vote. But the right to vote is undermined if Democrats succeed in striking down voter integrity laws and federalizing elections and in implementing practices that we know will expand voter fraud. When an illegal voter votes illegally, he or she is stealing the right to vote from American citizens who have that legal right. And it's not just me who said that. That was the majority opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court in the decision upholding the state of Indiana's photo ID laws. I represented the state of Texas and a number of other states in that litigation. The majority opinion by Justice John Paul Stevens, another lion of the left, explained that photo ID laws protect the integrity of elections, and when voter fraud occurs, it steals the vote from legal citizens. I don't know why the Democrats don't care about the crisis on the border. I don't know why the Democrats don't care about the children in the Biden cages today. I don't know why the Democrats don't care about the hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens with COVID that are coming into this country. I don't know why the Democrats don't care about the terrorists and gang members and violent criminals coming into this country. I don't know why the Democrats don't care about the human suffering their policies are causing. But what I do know is the Democrats today care about stealing elections. And there is no agenda item that is a higher priority than that. And let me note finally, the full Judiciary Committee should hold multiple hearings on the crisis on the border. But this subcommittee, the Constitution Subcommittee, should likewise hold hearings on that same topic. Article 2 of the Constitution provides that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. We have had presidents in the past who were reluctant to enforce immigration laws. Barack Obama was lousy at it. He created illegal categorical exemptions where he wouldn't enforce the law. But Obama never attempted what is happening now, what Joe Biden is doing right now, wholly refusing to follow federal immigration law, ordering his political subordinates, do not follow the law, do not enforce the law. It is brazenly illegal. It is brazenly unconstitutional. It is a violation of the Take Care Clause of the Constitution. And it is creating a constitutional crisis in this country because states like my home state of Texas are facing this crisis. And a president is utterly defying federal law. That's what this committee ought to be addressing. Unfortunately, for Senate Democrats, it's just not something they care about.
Thanks, Senator Cruz. Naturally, I'd be happy to talk to Senator Cruz about the future agenda of this subcommittee. And as one who has been in favor strongly of immigration reform, that's a topic that we could well address. But there is a subcommittee on immigration that actually has had hearings. I don't know whether Senator Cruz was there, but perhaps in conjunction with that subcommittee, which does have jurisdiction, this one could also address it. Let me bring us back to the reason that we're here today, which is to address voting rights, which are the means to hold accountable officials if they don't care about problems that they should care about. When public officials ignore or disregard their duty, the way to hold them accountable is at the ballot box. And we are here about the strictly nonpartisan, bipartisan cause of voting rights for Native Americans and Alaska Natives. And I think that Indian country might be a little bit offended, maybe even insulted, to know that Senator Cruz thinks that expanding voting rights in Indian country is somehow a means for Democrats to empower themselves. The simple fact of the matter is there's no prejudging how Native Americans are going to vote any more than any other American. And I might just point out that based on the record, there are a lot of Republicans, maybe even a majority of Republicans, living in Oklahoma. The Lumbee tribe in North Carolina, which is the largest Native tribe east of the Mississippi, recently voted overwhelmingly to elect Republican Representative Dan Bishop. Many, if not most, of the Native Americans that have been elected to Congress actually have been Republicans. Let me give you a partial list. Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma, Representative Mullen of Oklahoma, Representative Cole was Chickasaw, Representative Mullen, Cherokee, Representative Yvette Harrell of New Mexico, Cherokee, and that's just a partial list. More Republicans than Democrats elected to Congress have been Native Americans, including the last Native American elected to the United States Senate, Senator Ben Nighthorse Campbell of Colorado. He retired in 2005. Senator Murkowski famously won her 2010 write-in election on the strength of votes she received from Alaska Native voters in rural Alaska. Other Republicans in Alaska routinely receive a majority of the Alaska Native vote. So I would not be quick to prejudge the results of an election where more Native Americans, not fewer, were given the right to vote. And as to fraud in IDs, again, the kind of ID that the measure introduced by Senator Lujan would provide is actually the ID of Indian country, Native American IDs, not the absence of IDs, but an ID that is verifiable to Native Americans and Alaska Natives. I'm not testifying here, but this cause ought to be really bipartisan, and I'm very pleased that we have a diverse group of witnesses who will bring us facts, real facts, not rhetoric, because you know how important this issue is on the ground in real life to Native Americans who want accountability from their public officials. So let me introduce the witnesses who are here today, beginning with Ms. De Leon. We're very pleased to have you here today. Jacqueline De Leon is a staff attorney at the Native American Rights Fund, where she's led field hearings across Indian country on Native American voting rights. She's co-authored the NARF's report, Obstacles at Every Turn, Barriers to Political Participation Faced by Native American Voters and Practices, Ongoing Voter Rights Litigation. She is an enrolled member of the Isleta Pueblo and serves as a chair of the American Bar Association's bipartisan advisory committee to the Standing Committee on Election Law. She holds a JD from Stanford and a BA from Princeton University in philosophy. Mr. Edward Buchanan, as Senator Cruz mentioned, is Wyoming's 22nd Secretary of State. As a former Attorney General of the state of Connecticut, I very much respect your being here as a constitutional officer. I understand you serve as the state's chief election officer and additionally as chair of the state canvassing board. Mr. Buchanan, Secretary of State Buchanan, grew up in Goshen County, Wyoming, on his family's farm and ranch on Rawhide Creek. He graduated from the University of Wyoming with a bachelor's degree in political science and was commissioned in the United States Air Force. He subsequently received a master's degree in public administration from the University of Colorado and a degree in law from the University of Wyoming College of Law. Thank you for your service. President Jonathan Nez is currently president of the Navajo Nation. Prior to being elected president, he served as vice president of the Navajo Nation, and before that was vice president of the Shanto chapter and a delegate to the Navajo Nation Council representing several chapters. Thank you for being here today, President Nez, and thank you for bringing the First Lady of the tribe as well. Ms. Sarah Frankenstein is a partner at Gunderson, Palmer, Nelson, and Ashmore. She practices in the areas of civil litigation, civil rights and employment law, voting rights, personal injury, and insurance defense. Ms. Frankenstein is currently serving a 4-year term on the South Dakota Advisory Committee as vice chair, and that position reports to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. Ms. Frankenstein earned her BA and JD from the University of South Dakota. She served as law clerk to the Honorable Richard Beatty, U.S. District Court, South Dakota. And last but very much not least, Nicole Borromeo serves as Executive Vice President and General Counsel for the Alaska Federation of Natives, AFN. It's the oldest and largest Native organization in Alaska. Ms. Borromeo advises AFN's board and president on a wide variety of Alaska Native legislative and litigation matters, including civil and voting rights, civil law and voting rights. Prior to joining AFN, she held positions at several law firms in private practice. We thank you all for being here, and I'm going to ask you to rise, as is our custom, and take the oath. Do you each solemnly swear that the testimony that you will give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you very much. Ms. De Leon, we'll begin with you and go down the table.
Thank you, Senator Lujan, for the kind introduction and for championing NAVRA. And thank you, Chairman Blumenthal and Ranking Member Cruz, for the opportunity to testify. My name is Jacqueline De Leon. I'm a member of the Sleta Pueblo, and I'm a staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund, known as NARF, the nation's largest and oldest nonprofit law firm dedicated to advancing the rights of Native Americans. My testimony will focus on the need to fully restore the Voting Rights Act and pass the Native American Voting Rights Act due to ongoing, present-day neglect and racial discrimination that is stripping Native Americans of their political power. In 2018, the Native American Voting Rights Coalition completed field hearings across Indian country, which I co-led. We heard from approximately 125 witnesses about voting in federal and state elections. Our findings are extensively documented in a report which I have submitted to this committee. I'm humbled to be carrying their stories, tears, and demand for action with me. Today, many Native American reservations are rural, distant from the nearest off-reservation border town because of official policies to forcibly remove and segregate natives on remote and undesirable land. Travel to voting services, DMVs, and post offices can be over 100 miles away. Due to ongoing discrimination and governmental neglect, many Native Americans live in overcrowded homes that do not have addresses, do not receive mail, and are located on dirt roads that can be impassable in wintry November. The Native American Voting Rights Act, championed in the House by two Native members, Republican Tom Cole and Democrat Sharice Davids, would mandate on-reservation voting services and accommodations for homes that do not receive mail delivery services and do not have residential addresses on them. NARF has also successfully brought Native American voting rights cases in the last 4 years, including challenges to North Dakota's voter ID law that required a residential address on IDs when the state knew that there were homes on Native American reservations that did not have addresses on them. A challenge to Montana's ballot collection ban when tribes in Montana do not have residential mail delivery. A challenge to Alaska's witness signature requirement during a pandemic when elderly and single mothers would have had to break quarantine in order to comply. And a 2020 lawsuit challenging the refusal to open an in-person polling location on the Blackfeet Reservation. I'd like to pause on that last case. Pend Oreille County chose to keep in-person voting at their county seat, which ensured access for the over 90% white residents, but attempted to deny in-person voting to Blackfeet tribal members who do not get mail delivered to their homes and who would have had to travel 120 miles to vote. Indeed, relying upon the 14th and 15th Amendments and the VRA, Native American voters have filed nearly 100 lawsuits with a success rate of over 90%. These cases have been litigated in front of judges appointed by Republican and Democratic presidents. In short, the facts are so bad, we almost always win. Yet the Supreme Court's hostility towards voting rights imperils the ability of Native litigants to get the relief they deserve. In Shelby County v. Holder, the court suspended Section 5, robbing Native voters in Arizona, Alaska, parts of South Dakota, and North Carolina from pre-clearance protections. And in Brnovich v. DNC, the Supreme Court upheld 2 voting restrictions that had a disparate impact on Native American voters, contrary to the express purpose of Section 2. The need for federal action is urgent and compelling. For example, just last year, tribes and GOTV organizations successfully challenged a ballot collection ban in Montana under the state's right to vote provision. Yet the legislature passed another ballot collection ban this year, in a move that the Montana Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights described as intentional discrimination that will increase barriers to voters in Montana. Finally, NARF has collected extensive evidence of the racism faced by Native American voters in recent years by voting officials. In 2018, a San Juan County clerk in Utah committed fraud and backdated a false complaint against a Native American candidate. Less than 10 years in South Dakota, Native American voters were humiliated and forced to vote out of a chicken coop. This year, county officials spent $180,000 fighting against providing early voting on the Pasquayaqui Reservation. I urge this committee to do the necessary work of investigating and recording these injustices to fully restore the Voting Rights Act and to pass the Native American Voting Rights Act. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Secretary of State Buchanan.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Senator Blumenthal, and Ranking Member Senator Cruz. It's my privilege and honor to be with you today to speak on the proposed bill. The Wind River Reservation in Wyoming is about 2.2 million acres. It's located in the central part of Wyoming, and it's encompassed almost entirely in Fremont County, and it is the home to the Eastern Shoshone and the Northern Arapaho tribes. Speaking specifically to the proposed legislation before this committee, I think it's important to recognize that Wyoming is a rural state. Indeed, it's actually a frontier state with a population of roughly 580,000 people with great geographical distances between its towns. And as I read through the bill, many of the challenges enumerated in Section 2, subsection 8 of that bill apply to our entire state. Lack of broadband connectivity, unpaved roads, and very great distances to the nearest polling places. Despite these conditions, we conduct elections correctly, we conduct them with integrity, and that's due in large part to the dedication of our 23 county clerks. Now, at the local level in Fremont County, home of the Wind River Reservation, the county clerk's office enlists and coordinates with tribal leadership to recruit and utilize Native American election judges and poll workers. And they also provide materials and guidance for the tribes to conduct voter registration programs. And they established vote centers in 4 locations, including schools. Those are the primary population centers for Native Americans on the reservation, and they established those per the recommendation of tribal leaders. And these vote centers allow for voting in any location, irrespective of precinct. Native Americans also serve as vote center managers in our state in some of those vote center locations. At the state level, my office worked directly with Native American legislators and tribal leaders to implement the use of tribal identification cards for voter registration and voting. I personally traveled to the Wind River Reservation and met with tribal leaders, and I learned about the importance of the tribal ID to Native Americans. And together, we crafted legislation to accomplish our collective goals while remaining in compliance with the Help America Vote Act. I hope it's becoming apparent from my comments that I take my job very seriously and my county clerks take their job very seriously and with the utmost respect for the voting rights of all Wyoming citizens. I have several concerns with this legislation. First, it requires ballot drop boxes and allows for ballot harvesting. Ballot drop boxes are not authorized by state law, and recently proposed legislation limits who can deliver your ballot on your behalf. Allowing what amounts to unfettered ballot harvesting is a recipe for fraud. My next concern is how the legislation would affect Wyoming's status under the National Voter Registration Act. We are exempt from NVRA, also known as motor voter, along with 5 other states because Wyoming offers same-day voter registration. This exemption means that Wyoming is not required to utilize state and local DMV agencies or any other local agency to register voters. This bill in Section 5 would require federal agencies to register voters, which completely usurps the state's role in voter registration and conflicts with our current exemption under NVRA. Ironically, this now provides an opportunity where voters across Wyoming and other states could be treated unequally. And perhaps most concerning is that the establishment of a Native American voting task force creates the real potential for disparate treatment among the voting public in general and also among minority voters themselves. Potential 14th Amendment constitutional challenges could result and would be used as a catalyst to expand these mandated election practices to our entire state. And this is not an exaggeration. In reviewing this bill on page 11, lines 14 through 22, the legislation allows for any one of the three listed entities to individually apply to create the task force without the agreement of the others. This is particularly problematic for me as the Secretary of State and the county clerks who are also elected and administer our elections at the local level. Imagine your chief election officer or your other election officials having no say in whether these methodologies are implemented, yet we have the full responsibility to ensure that they work at the same time. And if that's not enough, this bill allows for nonprofit organizations and very loosely defines them as nonprofits who may in whole or even in part be involved in voting issues to apply for this task force. And this committee knows as well as I that many nonprofits in this area have political motives. I have seen it firsthand. Even when they say they are nonpartisan, they are anything but. And this legislation is a one-way street. No aspect of it involves a program to enhance election integrity while having the laudable goal of promoting accessibility. Instead, what we have before us is legislation that will be weaponized by politically motivated groups to advance the same heavy-handed federal takeover elections that cannot currently be accomplished in H.R. 1, S1, and now S2747. I believe the federal government already possesses the tools through the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, to address and investigate and remediate any true voting rights violation. We in Wyoming already achieve our collective goal, which is to engage our citizens, to encourage their participation, to get them to vote. And in Wyoming, we do that very well. I have publicly stated that I will travel anywhere in Wyoming to ensure that every Wyoming citizen, every Native American, indeed every eligible voter, can register to vote and can cast their ballot. That's my personal pledge. Federalism brings strength and liberty to the people. I believe that this bill is unnecessary and will only serve to further erode that fundamental concept. I look forward to your questions and thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Mr. Buchanan. President Nez.
Yate, Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Cruz, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about the importance of the Native American vote. I am accompanied by the First Lady of the Navajo Nation, Fifilia Nez. We are here to speak in favor and to protect the Navajo vote for our children, our grandchildren, and future generations. And we appreciate our Senator Ben Ray Lujan for being that champion and other senators for the introduction of the Native American Voting Rights Act of 2021. With over 27,000 square miles and 400,000 citizens, the Navajo Nation is the largest federally recognized tribe in the United States. Our land crosses 3 states, and we are represented by 6 U.S. senators and 5 members of the U.S. House of Representatives. Yet many of our citizens still face barriers to voting unique to Indian country. Today, I focus on our challenges when it comes to voting: geography, language, institutional barriers, and our socio-economic status. First, geography. Many of our citizens of the Navajo Nation live in rural areas and travel long distance to access basic needs and services. Getting to a polling station is often difficult as transportation options are limited. Our people rely on relatives or clan members for rides because most households only have one vehicle. Traveling to polling places can be particularly burdensome. For example, in 2018, election, some Navajos in Arizona had to travel 236 miles round trip to participate in early voting. During the 2020 election, some Navajos in New Mexico traveled 54 miles to deliver their ballot to the nearest drop box. For the 2018 election, many Navajo voters in Utah drove 392 round-trip miles to vote. Second, language. The Navajo language is widely spoken by Navajo voters, and it is the primary language for many Navajo people. And I think we all agree that the Navajo language helped win World War II for this great country of ours. Navajo is traditionally an oral, not written language, and many Navajos struggle to read, requiring in-person language assistance to cast a ballot. This means that moving to a complete vote-by-mail system would deny Navajo speakers the opportunity to vote. Third, institutional barriers. Homes across the nation lack formal street addresses. This creates problems when verifying an address to register to vote and make mail-in ballots less efficient. Navajo citizens do not receive home delivery and must travel to post office boxes. Mail delivery on the Navajo Nation is often slow and unreliable. For example, a ballot sent from Window Rock, Arizona to the county recorder in St. John's, Arizona must first route through Gallup, New Mexico, then to Albuquerque, New Mexico, then to Phoenix, then to Show Low, and then finally to St. John's. At a minimum, this takes 10 days from sending to receipt. This increases the risk of a ballot going uncounted. Because of the long delay in mailing, many Navajo citizens prefer to vote in person or utilize drop boxes to ensure their vote is counted. Fourth, socioeconomic factors. Navajo citizens face disparities in education, employment, and housing. Only 4% of the nation's enrolled citizens have college degrees. The current unemployment rate is 48.5%, and the poverty rate is 38%, twice that of Arizona. These factors make it harder for Navajo voters to secure vehicles and housing, magnifying the problem listed above. In conclusion, protecting the Native American vote requires considering the unique challenges faced by Navajo voters. The nation continues to fight repeated efforts by state and their political subdivisions through restrictive voting laws and policies that impede access to the polls. The Navajo Nation cannot rely on states to provide protection to our right to vote, and therefore calls on Congress to take action. The federal government must fulfill its trust responsibility and safeguard our Navajo citizens' right to vote. We thank Chairman Blumenthal for supporting the Native American Voting Rights Act and are grateful for Senator Leahy's efforts to include the act in the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement. It's not about Democrat or Republican. It's about doing the right thing. We look forward to working with the 117th Congress to fully realize protections for Navajos and all Native Americans who wish to exercise their inherent right to vote in the United States. We ask Congress to make it easier for the first peoples of this land to vote and to not make it harder. Please protect the Native American and Alaska Native vote. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, President Nez. Ms. Frankenstein?
Thank you. Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Cruz, and members of the subcommittee.
If you could turn on your microphone.
Is that better? Thank you. My name is Sarah Frankenstein, and I'm a private practice attorney and partner in the law firm of Gunderson, Palmer, Nelson, and Ashmore in Rapid City, South Dakota. I practice voting rights and election law. I advise and defend election administrators in the Midwest in all aspects of elections and voting rights. These matters often involve issues unique to American Indian voting, as well as tribal and county governmental concerns. I, as well as election administrators in reservation counties that I work with, regardless of race or party, have a number of concerns with the proposed Native American Voting Rights Act. Under this bill, counties and states would have to hold elections under two different sets of law. Those living off reservation land would vote according to state law. Those living on reservation land would vote according to this federal law. Election administrators would have the burden of conducting the same election in two often drastically different manners. One example is the section of the bill that allows a state, county, or any court, including potentially tribal courts, to require absentee balloting even when prohibited by state law, or to require mail-in balloting even though prohibited by state law. This would result in, for instance, half a county engaging in only in-person election day voting, and the other half of the same county being sent unsolicited mail-in ballots. The bill also mandates ballot drop boxes on the reservation, even if prohibited under state law. There are no requirements for drop box security. The election administrator is not allowed any say in where they're placed. Rather, the tribes select where the drop boxes will be placed. Such takes control over elections out of the hands of the election administrator for which she is trained and elected, and instead allows tribes to control the federal, state, and county election process. Tribes govern their own tribal elections, and each state is to govern state and county elections. Giving tribal government control over state and county elections creates serious legal and practical concerns. The bill also legalizes ballot harvesting on the reservation when the practice is prohibited otherwise by state law. The bill allows, quote, any person, unquote, to engage in unlimited ballot harvesting. Any person may include a paid campaign worker or a convicted felon, whether authorized by the voter or not, to handle that voter's ballot. In some states, such as mine, a voter may be challenged on election day as having moved or being otherwise ineligible to vote. In my state, the challenge method is the only way a non-resident voter can be kept from voting in the wrong state or county. Under Section 12 of the bill, a challenger exercising that important statutory duty may be detained and removed by tribal law enforcement. This would, in effect, allow tribal law enforcement to determine who is eligible to vote by residency rather than the election administrator. Or it will simply prohibit any challenges whatsoever to those living out of the state or county voting in the wrong elections. The bill allows voters to use a public building as their place for receiving and dropping off absentee or mail-in ballots. Under this provision of the bill, a tribe may designate, for example, a recreation center as one precinct's tribally designated building. A voter may apply for an absentee ballot to be sent to the rec center, along with hundreds of others doing the same thing. There are no provisions in the bill to safeguard those absentee ballots. They may come into the rec center's mail drop with no person in charge of ensuring that all ballots ultimately received are ultimately received only by the correct and individual voter who requested the ballot. The bill also allows tribes to demand that absentee ballots be sent without the voters requesting those ballots, resulting in hundreds or thousands of unsolicited ballots being sent to a public address. Allowing tribes to force election administrators to send out thousands of unsolicited ballots, even where illegal under state law, creates numerous problems. One tribal residence may receive 10 ballots, for example. Without each voter requesting each ballot, one person at that residence could vote all 10 ballots without the other 9 individuals even knowing. In addition to the ballot integrity issues invoked in such a situation, this is a solution in search of a problem. While it is true that some reservation residents have no physical mailing address, we do not need to designate public buildings to serve as mailing receptacles. Post office boxes already do that. Thank you for your time, Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Cruz.
Thank you very much, Ms. Borromeo. Hope I have been pronouncing your name correctly.
You have been, Chairman Blumenthal. Good afternoon, Ranking Member Cruz and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Nicole Borromeo, and I am the Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the Alaska Federation of Natives. Established in 1966 to achieve a fair and just settlement of Aboriginal land claims, AFN is the oldest and largest statewide Native membership organization in Alaska. Having worked to overcome decades-long disenfranchisement of Alaska Native voters and counting as members over 500 federally recognized tribes and regional and village Alaska Native corporations established under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971, AFN is well positioned to help the committee understand the continuing need to protect the Alaska Native vote. Before I address Alaska's need for S4, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021, or the VRAA, and the Frank Harrison, Elizabeth Paratovich, and Miguel Trujillo Native American Voting Rights Act of 2021, or NAVRA, I would like to acknowledge two women who have helped Alaska Natives in our quest to achieve equal access to the political process. Elizabeth Paratovich, one of NAVRA's namesakes, was a Tlingit tribal member and civil rights leader in Alaska. She secured passage of the Alaska Equal Rights Act of 1945, which banned restrictive covenants and made it unlawful to deny public accommodations with signs saying "No Natives, no dogs," and other Jim Crow measures intended to segregate Alaska Natives from non-Natives. Senator Lisa Murkowski has also been a steadfast leader on issues of critical importance to the Alaska Native community. She has been a staunch advocate for making registration and voting more accessible for Alaska Natives, including in our rural Native villages. AFN applauds her for her continued work with us on S4 and NAVRA. Senator Murkowski is a civil rights and voting rights champion who is committed to making the most fundamental right, the right to vote, equally accessible to all Americans. Turning to the VRAA and NAVRA, I will invoke the words of Elizabeth Paratovich, who once observed, "Asking you to give me equal rights implies that they are yours to give. Instead, I must demand that you stop trying to deny me the rights that all people deserve." The power and the force of her words are just as true today as the Senate considers passage of S4 and the provisions of NAVRA in Title III of the Act as when she first spoke them. The VRAA responds to several Supreme Court decisions that have impaired enforcement of voting rights for Alaska Natives, including Shelby County versus Holder, which eliminated Section 5 coverage in Alaska, and several other states with a long history of voter discrimination, and Baranovich versus DNC, which has made it more difficult for Alaska Natives to bring vote denial or abridgment claims under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. However, even if there were no discriminatory rules or practices in Alaska, which there are, Alaska Natives would still face challenges in securing equal access to elections, such as geographic isolation, extreme weather, lack of regular mail service, socioeconomic barriers, including stifling rates of poverty, limited English proficiency, illiteracy, and a lack of broadband, all of which are compounded by the state's inadequate resources which they allocate for elections in rural Native villages. NAVRA is an essential part of S4 because it targets the unique barriers that Alaska Native voters experience when we attempt to register to vote, cast a ballot, and have that ballot counted. Congress has broad authority to enact NAVRA under its enforcement clause powers through the Reconstruction Amendments, and also through its constitutional abilities to regulate relations with tribes and their citizens through the government-to-government relationship that the United States has with federally recognized tribes. Protecting the right to vote is not a partisan issue. It is a fundamental civil rights issue for Alaska Natives. I will close with more enduring words of Elizabeth Paratovich. Speak your intent to help us overcome discrimination. Now is the time to act. Now is the time to pass S4, the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021, and Title III of that bill, NAVRA. Thank you very much for your time and attention. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have that would help Alaska Natives and other voters across Indian country with access to the polls. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My understanding is that Senator Klobuchar is available to make her opening statement I apologize for the delay. Senator, if you're available, please go ahead.
Yes, I'll be quick. I wanted to, we were doing a hearing, Senator Blunt and myself, over in rules on oversight of the libraries, which went quite well. But this is a really important hearing, and I wish I could be there in person. And it couldn't be happening on a more important day in terms of us attempting to move forward and pledging to continue to move forward on voting legislation. I want to thank you, Chair Blumenthal, for holding the hearing. And I also want to thank Ben Ray Lujan for his leadership. I am the chair of the Rules Committee, and we want to pass all these bills. And I want to make sure to participate today and express my strong support for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the inclusion of the Native American Voting Rights Act, which, as I mentioned, Senator Lujan is leading. Provisions from the Native American Voting Rights Act are also included in the Freedom to Vote Act, which is my bill with Senator Manchin and many others, which came out of the work that we did on the Rules Committee. So all of that process aside, what is this really about? And your witnesses know it well. This is about the salvation of our democracy, and we should not stop fighting until we protect the sacred right to vote. My state of Minnesota has a large and diverse tribal population, and I know that Native American communities in particular face unique challenges all over the country when it comes to registering to vote, casting their ballot, and ultimately having their ballot counted. In the lead up to the election last year, tribal leaders across the country expressed concern that their communities were being left behind in the face of significant obstacles to their voting. Some Native American voters had to drive up to 280 miles one way just to cast their ballot, just to exercise their constitutional right to vote. Others saw widespread closures of polling locations on tribal lands, and many experienced issues receiving their mail-in ballots because Native American homes on tribal lands often do not have, I'm sure you've discussed this, traditional residential mailing addresses. Since the election, almost 400 bills have been introduced across the country in every state. Over 30 of them have been signed into law in 19 states, including states that are home to many tribes like Montana, Arizona, and Oklahoma. These bills aren't just empty threats or some kind of a bullet point on a political brochure. They are real efforts to stop people from voting, and many could make it difficult, even more difficult, for Native Americans to exercise their right to vote. The Native American Voting Rights Act will help address many of the challenges tribal communities face in accessing the ballot with its basic safeguards so that election officials accept tribal ID for voter ID purposes. One early voting ballot drop box and polling location per precinct. What a difference that would make on tribal lands. And making sure that states provide mail-in voting materials in applicable native languages as well as in English. These protections will make a big difference in tribal communities across the country. As Congressman Lewis once said, your vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most powerful, nonviolent tool we have to create a more perfect union. So let's do this. Let's create a more perfect union. And we know that to do that, our democracy must work for all citizens who can participate. This hearing is an important step forward in making that happen. Thank you very much, Chairman Blumenthal.
Thanks, Senator Klobuchar, and thanks for your leadership in this area. We'll have 5-minute rounds of questioning. We've been joined by Senator Ossoff. If any of our Republican colleagues are participating remotely, I hope they'll let us know. Let me begin, President Nez, with a couple of questions. First of all, the Navajo Nation, is it a Democratic nation or a Republican nation? Do you regard it as one party or another in terms of its identification?
Thank you for the question, Chairman Blumenthal and Ranking Member Cruz, members of the committee. You know, historically, the Navajo Nation started out being a Republican nation. And over the years, with many more of our constituents voting in the elections, there has been a change in tide. But let me just also say, Chairman, members of the committee, that during this past election, there was an overwhelmingly large turnout, not just Democrats, but Republicans and independents who went to the polls. Even amongst a pandemic, people went to the polls. And now we see, these types of state bills getting passed, which, really pushes back on the right to vote for our Navajo people. So thank you for that question.
You heard, I think, Mr. Buchanan compare Native American voters to voters who are residents of any rural state. Isn't there a difference between rural voters generally and the conditions of Native Americans that create additional barriers on
Absolutely.
reservations?
Absolutely, Chairman and members of the committee, thank you for that question. Let me just give you an example of the past few elections, especially when it's in November. We get some severe weather, muddy roads, we got snow, rain, and people have a hard time getting to their polling locations because of the lack of infrastructure on the Navajo Nation. There is a need for better roads, and we're also looking at how some states are wanting to go voting through the internet. But we don't have the best broadband or telecommunication in the country. And so with the funds that are coming to tribal communities, it is a start to get us into the 21st century in terms of infrastructure development.
So you really face unique barriers.
Unique barriers.
Geographic isolation, the lack of transportation, language barriers, non-traditional mailing addresses.
Yes, sir.
And a general lack of resources. Let me ask you, Ms. De Leon, because you brought some of these cases. Shelby said, in effect, circumstances have changed. We don't need the Voting Rights Act pre-clearance process anymore. Could you respond based on your knowledge of the circumstances among our Native Americans and Alaska Native?
Thank you so much for that question. I think it's so important in this day and age to recognize that there's ongoing present-day racial discrimination that's occurring against Native Americans. And I think it's helpful to give a personal anecdote here. Last election cycle, we negotiated with several counties in Montana because there they decided to shut down the polling locations on the reservations, but they decided to keep the in-person polling locations to their county seats that had, a very significant over 90% non-Native populations. And in the course of those negotiations with a county official, she said to me, "I don't want to catch COVID on the reservation." And, at the time, the transmission rates between the county and, the reservation were within a percentage point. There wasn't an appreciable difference. But, the risk that she was willing to take for her non-Native constituents, that she wasn't willing to take for her Native constituents, I don't have any interest in trying to decipher what her motivation is or, what was in her heart. But rather, I think that looking at what the effect was is important. And the effect there is that Native Americans would have to travel significant distances, equivalent from us here having to travel all the way to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania and back in order to cast their ballot because they don't even receive residential mail at home. And so voting by mail was not an option. Those feelings in her heart are ultimately had an appreciable impact on the Native Americans' ability to vote.
Thank you. I'm going to stay within my 5 minutes and then we'll have a second round. So I'll have more questions for the other witnesses, and I'll turn now to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to each of the witnesses for being here. Secretary Buchanan, as Wyoming Secretary of State, you oversee state election procedures. The bill that this committee is considering right now would, among other things, mandate ballot harvesting in Indian country. It would grant tribes full authority to reject and remove poll watchers not affiliated with the state. And it would allow tribes to request absentee ballots even when voters haven't requested them. In your judgment, would these provisions increase or decrease confidence in the integrity of Wyoming state and federal elections?
And thank you for the question, Senator Cruz. In my estimation, each of the things you mentioned in the legislation would decrease the confidence people have in their elections. There are really no safeguards that you can place on ballot drop boxes, especially in remote locations, that can prevent those ballots from being lost or stolen. I've often stated, it actually can go against the accessibility argument, because you could have someone destroy a ballot box, a drop box, and it would almost be impossible to know whose ballot was lost. How would you notify those people that their ballot was destroyed? You'd have really no way of doing that, because the ballots would be destroyed. The other things you mentioned are similar to that. You cannot have an election that people don't believe in, because if they don't believe that the result has integrity, you will drive down election participation. And that goes against the entire premise, really, and goal, I think, that we collectively share.
Thank you, Secretary Buchanan. One of the unfortunate things listening to this hearing, we live in a time where the country is very polarized and it is divided politically. And often it seems that Democrats talk to the left, Republicans talk to the right. We don't talk to each other. We don't have conversations. We don't. Liberals listen to left-leaning news. Conservatives listen to right-leaning news. And the discussion here sadly reflects this. So we heard testimony from two witnesses, Secretary Buchanan and Ms. Frankenstein, about the risks of voter fraud from ballot harvesting. We heard testimony about the risks of voter fraud from drop boxes. We heard testimony about the risks of voter fraud from sending ballots to voters who didn't request them, sending them to public buildings with no security provisions whatsoever. And what is striking to me is that none of the witnesses invited by the Democratic majority addressed those issues in any way, shape, or form. None of the Democratic senators who spoke addressed those issues in any way, shape, or form. It's not like they're engaging in saying, well, yes, ballot harvesting, there have been problems, but. No, they don't engage in it at all. They simply ignore it. I'm looking, for example, in the state of Texas. In November, the Texas Attorney General brought an indictment against one Texan for 134 felony counts for ballot harvesting. And this is a woman who worked in the Mejia State Supported Living Center, who submitted voter registration applications, for 67 residents without their signature, without their effective consent. A number of those residents had been adjudicated by a court as mentally incapacitated. And so you have an instance where a political operative is seeking to vote for people who are legally ineligible to vote and who lack the capacity to make those determinations. That's why so many states prohibit ballot harvesting. And yet, the Democratic proponents of these bills, they don't address that. They don't dispute it. They don't have any facts to say to the contrary. Secretary Buchanan, what is your judgment as someone charged with administering elections as to the risks that ballot harvesting poses?
Thank you for the question, Senator Cruz. Ballot harvesting, especially in this bill, the only limit on it was that you couldn't be compensated, I believe, proportionally to the number of ballots you collected. And the simplest example that I can think of is you have someone who is perhaps trusted to collect ballots, but let's think about it from the perspective of not collecting ballots from people that may share your political beliefs, but you have bad actors out there who collect ballots from those who they disagree, but the people who cast those ballots don't know this. So what's to prevent somebody who harvests these ballots from simply throwing them away and not taking them to where they are supposed to go? And
We're certainly throwing them away on a partisan basis. So if people vote in a way that is inconsistent with the operatives' partisan leaning, you know, earlier Chairman Blumenthal suggested that I somehow believed the Republicans would not do well with increased Native American turnout. I don't believe that at all. I think Republicans can and have competed very effectively for the Native American vote and for votes across this country. What I believe is different, which is that voter fraud, although it occurs in both parties, and there have been people convicted of voter fraud to benefit both parties, voter fraud systemically benefits Democrats. And what is striking is, whether I believe that or not, Senate Democrats believe that, because every proposal they're advancing are proposals that would expand voter fraud. Ms. Frankenstein, let me ask a final question. One of the provisions of this bill grants tribes the authority to reject and remove poll watchers who aren't affiliated with the state. And that's a fairly remarkable provision. When people tell you they don't want outside observers even seeing what happens in an election, you should question what's going on. Is there any legitimate justification for giving the ability to throw election observers out and prevent even the mildest form of scrutiny as to the integrity of the election? And what are the risks of the integrity of the election of being able to throw observers out? And please turn your microphone on.
Thank you. I see no advantage to allowing such practices. In my state and in others with Indian tribes, we already have difficulty enforcing state election integrity laws on the reservation. There's an issue with who has jurisdiction on the reservation to enforce state laws. This compounds that problem. If we allow tribal law enforcement to determine basically who is eligible and who is not, by virtue of having the power of who gets to stay in the polling place and observe, we've got a recipe for the tribes taking over who's eligible to vote rather than our elected and trained election administrators and our legislators of the state who enact those voting laws.
And if I can,
I'm going to go on to
Sure.
Senator Ossoff because he's waited very patiently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. Thank you to our panel. Ms. De Leon, although there are no currently federally recognized tribes in Georgia, we do have more than 100,000 voting-age Native Americans in the state of Georgia, including thousands of members of the Lower Muskegee Creek tribe based in Wiggum, the Georgia Tribe of Eastern Cherokee based in Dahlonega, the Cherokee Indians of Georgia based in St. George, and others. And tribal leaders in Georgia, including Chief McCormick of the Lower Muskogee, have described to me an atmosphere of discrimination and significant structural barriers that tribal members face when trying to register to vote or to cast a ballot. The Supreme Court recently made it harder for voters to challenge discriminatory voting laws and practices under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, including those that may target Native American voters. Can you please explain or share your perspective on the impact of Supreme Court's decision in Brnovich, how it might jeopardize Native voting access, including and especially for relatively smaller tribes?
Thank you so much for that thoughtful question. We were really disturbed by the Brnovich decision, and it will have a tremendous impact in Indian country. And I think Georgia actually offers a good example of how that would work in practice. So you mentioned that there were over 100,000 Native Americans in Georgia, but that there were small isolated communities. The assumption, and I think is right, is that the majority of your Native American residents live in urban centers and may not have these type of structural problems, but that there are isolated pockets of communities that could be targeted. And in Brnovich, what the court said is if the size of the affected population was small relative to the total size of the minority population, then that's okay. Essentially saying that there is a de minimis exception, which is to say that there's, if it's so small, then it doesn't count. Discrimination is discrimination, and effectively, this law would now allow, entire tribes, thousands of people, to be discriminated against with impunity. And so we desperately need a Section 2 legislative fix.
Thank you, Ms. De Leon. And how, in your view, would the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act in its latest draft form restore and strengthen Section 2? And what would be the impact on ballot access for Native Americans?
That's Section 2 has, the VRAA has a legislative fix currently that says that de minimis exceptions are not allowed, and so that would get rid of the court's reasoning in that regard.
Could you share a little bit with the committee, please, Ms. De Leon, on the history of Jim Crow era discrimination as it affected Native Americans? My colleagues and I may be more familiar with the particulars of the structures of discrimination that targeted Black Americans. But states with substantial Native American populations sometimes made Native voters disavow and prove they were no longer culturally Native American, or imposed literacy tests impossible for Native voters to pass given a lack of proficiency in English. Can you comment on that history and its lingering impact, please?
Thank you. So I think that it's important to note that that history is not very long ago. We held those series of field hearings that I mentioned, and we heard from elderly witnesses and people who had heard from people, their grandmothers that endured that abuse. And what the story is don't vote in that system. It makes you not Indian. Don't vote in that system. You're not allowed. And that message is a direct result of state policies that were intended to disenfranchise Native Americans, and it was a lie that was perpetrated in order to rob Native Americans of their political power. And it still resonates today. And I think that it's really important that we take federal action to correct that error and to protect Native Americans from ongoing state abuses.
Thank you, ma'am. And my time is expiring, but I'll just say I think the United States government has a profound moral and historical obligation to ensure ballot access for tribes. And there may be some differences of opinion on the particulars of this legislation. I hope we can come together, Democrats and Republicans, to pass a bill that will resolve these issues that persist and make it more difficult for Native Americans to participate in our democracy after what these tribes have endured for centuries at the hands of the federal government. We have an obligation to make that extra effort to ensure that their voices are fully heard and represented in our democracy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Senator Ossoff. Do we have any Republicans or other senators who are participating remotely and would like to ask questions? If not, we'll begin a second round. I want to tell our witnesses you've been very patient. I apologize for the vote, which delayed our starting. If any of you have planes to catch, you should not hesitate to raise your hand and just excuse yourself. But you are all very valuable in terms of the information you're providing. Let me talk about ballot collection. We are going to talk about ballot collection because it is important to the franchise in some circumstances. It's known pejoratively, disparagingly, disingenuously as ballot harvesting. Let me ask Ms. Borromeo, you've heard what's been said about voter fraud. Could you tell us, based on your very lengthy experience, and I'm going to ask Ms. De Leon the same question, does ballot collection lead to voter fraud in the way that you've heard it described here? What are the facts as you know them?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quite frankly, the Alaska Native community would welcome the opportunity to have some voter fraud. But of course, that requires having polling places implemented in the first place in our villages. And that's really the basic step one that we're at for a large majority of the state. So if we can't have voting on par with our urban areas, then quite frankly, we're just never going to get to the voter fraud concerns that Senator Cruz has raised today. So it's a non-issue really for us right now in Alaska.
You don't know of ballot collection leading to voter fraud?
I don't know of that, no, Mr. Chairman.
No massive voter fraud resulting from ballot collection in your experience?
Not to the best of my knowledge.
How about in your experience, Ms. De Leon?
Thank you. So I think it's important to pause for a minute, and I want to just correct something that Ms. Frankenstein had implied. She said there was a problem with voter fraud on reservations in South Dakota, or a problem enforcing on voter fraud. And I just want to flag that because, South Dakota has a history of making false allegations of voter fraud against Native Americans that have flexed their power. So shortly after an election in South Dakota, where a candidate was elected by Native American voters, there was a flood of false affidavits, 50 of them, accusing Native Americans of fraud. Those were baseless, they were tossed out, but there's this lingering implication that Native Americans are somehow untrustworthy or that they aren't able to conduct free and fair elections. They are. As for ballot collection, ballot collection is necessary because of the structural deficiencies that we've been talking about today. So if you live, 50 miles from a post office and you're living on a dirt road in an unaddressed house and you don't have access to a car, you often pick up and drop off mail for your neighbors and for your friends. During election season, organizations that have a working vehicle will come onto the reservation and will pick up and drop off ballots for people that are too impoverished to make a 100-mile round trip to drop off their ballot. It's done in order to overcome those structural barriers. If we solve those structural barriers, then we can have a conversation about fraud. Fraud which, I would note, not only is non-existent, but in the cases of ballot collection, already is prosecuted under existing laws if it so occurs.
Ballot fraud is against the law.
Exactly.
I know you may have to catch a flight, Ms. Borromeo. I'd like to just ask you the same question that I asked Ms. De Leon about Section 2 and the court's rationale, Shelby Court's rationale, that somehow circumstances have changed. We don't need Section 2 pre-clearance. Is there still a need for this kind of oversight and scrutiny in your state among Alaska Natives? And I should just point out for the record, your state has 2 Republican senators.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we also have a Republican representative in the House as well. There is still very much a need, and we hope that through NAVRA and the VRAA that those protections are once again put in place to ensure that Alaska Natives have the same access to the ballot process as non-natives. And I do apologize, but I have to fly 4,000 miles through 4 time zones to make it back for pressing redistricting work tomorrow. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. If there's any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to respond in writing.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Anyone else who has to fly 4 time zones can leave now. Otherwise, the door is barred. Let me ask President Nez about the collection of ballots. You've heard the explanation from Ms. De Leon about why this kind of ballot collection has been not only necessary but also free of fraud. Would you agree with her?
I agree. And no evidence of fraud on the Navajo Nation within the states and the counties. And let me also just say that there is considerable influence from the Secretary of State and also the counties. And even at one point, Chairman Blumenthal and Ranking Member Cruz and members of the committee, we had to take the state of Arizona and also the counties to court so that they could provide the Navajo language at the polling sites. And we also wanted to make sure that there was more of an opportunity for our citizens to cast their ballots. Now, with some of the laws that have been put in place regarding ID laws, showing your ID, if you don't have an ID at the polling place, you can cast a provisional ballot. And then when you do cast a provisional ballot, you have to go to the county seat to get that verified. And some of the Navajo people have to travel 3 hours, 6 hours round trip just to go and verify their ballot. And many times, as I was stated in my testimony, they can't get a ride or maybe have someone drive them to get their ballot verified. And so that infringes on their right to cast a ballot.
Do you know what percentage of the Navajo Nation is registered to vote? Do you have any idea?
Oh, wow. That's a good question, Chairman. I mean, based on this past election, I can get back to you on that. But one thing I want to note, too, is that, with the people voting in the election has increased over time. And, the reason why it has increased is we put the tribal elections, president and the tribal council elections, the same time, at least in the state of Arizona, same time as the election in the state. And that brings up political participation. And you saw that number increasing for these past few elections on the Navajo Nation for the state, the county, the state, and the federal elections.
Thank you. One last question. Tell me whether, in your opinion, the tribal identification is less reliable than, let's say, a motor vehicle license in another state. Is that somehow a second class form of identification, less reliable or verifiable?
Chairman, thank you for that question. I think as a sovereign nation, a tribal ID should be just as equal as any other ID in this country. Again, with these laws being passed, they're saying that tribal ID is utilizing that at the polling places are invalid. And when we, as a sovereign nation, know best, and we do know who are tribal citizens because they verify, their lineage and their Native American or Navajo-ness, if you want to call it that, Chairman, there in our communities. And so it should be just as valid as a driver's license or any other ID.
I think this is a really critical point. President Nez, Connecticut is blessed with 2 federally recognized tribes. We're very proud of their immense contributions to our state. The Mashantucket Pequots and the Mohegan, both great tribal sovereign nations.
Absolutely.
As Attorney General, I learned a lot about this concept of sovereignty and the respect that it is entitled to somehow regard tribal identification as second class or less reliable, I think, again, is really offensive to the great Native Americans who were the original residents of this country. Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have here a letter that was sent by an individual who describes herself as enrolled Blackfeet, enrolled Haida, Alaska Native, and also carries in her DNA her father's Northern Cheyenne contribution. And she expresses her deep concerns about this bill and how the bill would undermine her right to vote. And I would ask unanimous consent that this letter be entered into the record.
Without objection.
President Nez, thank you for being here. You testified a minute ago that the voter turnout in the Navajo Nation had been increasing and increasing considerably, and in particular in the 2020 election increased considerably. Do you have any reliable estimates as to what the rate of voter turnout was in the Navajo Nation in the last election?
Thank you for that question, Senator Cruz and Chairman Blumenthal, members of the committee. Regarding the voting turnout, we encourage our Navajo citizens to vote for their candidate of choice. And with the election as, going through a pandemic, we've seen the divisiveness in this country play out on our televisions at home and even in the news on the radio. And I think the Navajo public came out in full force to make a stand. And keep in mind, 27,000 square miles, Senator, of land, Navajo Nation, 3 states. So we have to deal with the states of New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah, as well as the counties within those 3 states. But I think with the large participation, I've heard that even in some polling stations, polling precincts, there was as high as 70% turnout. And that's for both parties, Republican and Democrat. And so we can get that number. I don't have that number on hand, Senator, but I definitely have been asking the counties to forward that information to me, and yet to this day, I have yet to receive that as well.
So the studies I've seen, one study conducted before the 2020 election found that 77% of Native Americans voted in the last local, state, and/or national election. And then a separate study indicated in the 2020 election that the Navajo Nation had a turnout rate as high as 90%, which is a staggeringly high figure. I don't know how reliable those studies are. Do you have any independent judgment in terms of whether those numbers are accurate in the ballpark?
Again, Senator, I've heard reports of 70% turnout in some of the precincts on the Arizona side. And like I said, I did ask the counties to get the Navajo Nation government some of those statistics. And yet to this day, I have not received that information.
Well, those are striking numbers, and they are considerably higher than nationally the general public turned out at a rate of about 67% in the 2020 election. And so that is encouraging that Native Americans are exercising their right to vote. Secretary Buchanan, one of the Democratic senators, asked questions and invoked the Jim Crow laws, which are truly shameful chapters in our American history. I'm curious, Secretary Buchanan, which party wrote the Jim Crow laws?
The Democratic Party.
So the Jim Crow laws were written by Democratic politicians. They were designed to prevent voters from voting Democratic politicians out of office. They were fundamentally corrupt. I would note the Republican Party was founded, our first president was Abraham Lincoln, and it was founded to oppose slavery and to oppose the corruption in the Democratic Party that we saw in the Jim Crow laws decades later. Chairman Blumenthal suggested that ballot harvesting really is not problematic at all. And the implication was anyone suggesting that there's a risk of fraud is doing so for partisan reasons. I want to read to you a quote from the Carter-Baker Commission on ballot harvesting. The Carter-Baker Commission concluded, quote, "Citizens who vote at home, at nursing homes, at the workplace, or in church are more susceptible to pressure, overt and subtle, or to intimidation. Vote buying schemes are far more difficult to detect when citizens vote by mail. States, therefore, should reduce the risks of fraud and abuse in absentee voting by prohibiting third-party organizations, candidates, and political party activists from handling absentee ballots. Now, Secretary Buchanan, am I right that Jimmy Carter was not a partisan Republican?
Senator Cruz, you are correct, and I think it's important to note that with ballot harvesting, how do you know there's not fraud, first off? Because someone who casts a ballot that does not arrive or is not delivered, they really have no way of knowing that it wasn't delivered unless they show up to the polls perhaps and then try to vote in person and they're allowed to vote. That'd be the first sign. And so it's problematic. And I talked a little bit about these nonpartisan groups, third-party ballot collectors. It's the same way. All of these nonprofits, they call themselves nonpartisan, but they're really not. And they're on both sides of the political aisle. And you will have instances where those groups will target certain communities, presupposing how people vote, and they will be free to go undetected, take those ballots, and directly affect the results of an election. There's no way that can't happen, and the hard part of it is you won't even know that it's happened. And we're naive to think that it wouldn't.
Well, I want to thank each of the witnesses for your testimony. I agree that we should vigorously protect every American's right to vote. But one of the ways we protect every American's right to vote is by ensuring election integrity and preventing voter fraud that steals the right to vote from legal and eligible voters. And unfortunately, this bill, like so many of the bills that Senate Democrats are pushing, would expand voter fraud rather than combat it, and I think it would be a serious mistake.
Thanks, Senator Cruz. Mr. Buchanan, I'm curious. The population of Wyoming is 580,000 people, roughly?
That's roughly correct.
What percentage are Native American?
It's a relatively small percentage. I don't have the exact percentage to give you.
What percentage of the non-Native Americans are registered to vote?
About 70%.
What percentage of the Native Americans are registered to vote?
I don't have that number.
You don't know?
I do not have that, the exact number. I would be guessing if I gave you an answer. And the first answer to the other question was an estimate as well.
And what percentage of registered voters in the last election among non-Native Americans went to the polls?
Our turnout was about 70%.
And among the Native Americans?
That number, Mr. Chairman, comprises all Wyoming citizens. I don't have it broken out by non-Native and Native.
So you don't know what percentage of Native Americans versus non-Native Americans went to the polls or are registered to vote?
I can get that information for you. I'd be guessing if I told you.
I'd appreciate that. How about South Dakota, Ms. Frankenstein? How many people live in South Dakota?
Roughly 900,000.
And what percentage of them, non-Native Americans, are registered to vote?
I don't know the current number. I can tell you that in the past we've had higher registration rates among our American Indian residents than among our white residents.
And how about turnout?
I couldn't tell you that current data either. We'd have to look at that county by county. Otherwise, we don't track people by race in the polling place.
You don't know what percentage of Native American registered voters went to the polls?
Not with recent data, and it varies county by county.
Could you get that for us?
I can, yes.
Thank you. Let me ask Ms. De Leon, I think one very important point here relates to what your organization has done. The Native American Rights Fund has brought a number of successful lawsuits. Your batting average is pretty high in seeking to vindicate Native American voting rights against discriminatory practices in states like South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Alaska. Native American voters have been successful in your defense of voting rights. How important has Section 2 been to protecting those rights? And in your view, how does Section 5 preclearance complement Section 2 litigation? I realize this sounds like a technical question, but it goes to the core of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, as you well know.
Well, thank you so much for that question. Section 2 is absolutely vital to Native American communities. We have, as you mentioned, an over 90% success rate in front of Republican and Democratic judges because our facts are so terrible. But Section 2 has currently been threatened by the Supreme Court, in particular with this de minimis type of reasoning. And we need Section 2 because, in particular, federal courts, we need to have strong federal courts because across the states, there are unfavorable state courts that do not uphold voting rights of citizens, and we don't have a forum there. With the dilution of Section 2, we've been forced into state courts, and we've had success in Montana, but we've not brought cases that we otherwise could have brought in states where there are hostile forums. And so, it's the responsibility of the federal government to protect the civil rights of American citizens, and that's why we need a robust Section 2 and Voting Rights Act. As for Section 5, Section 5 previously provided preclearance protections in Alaska, parts of South Dakota, for the state of Arizona, and parts of North Carolina. And those protections not only are important when they're implemented, but they are important as a backdrop for states when they're considering discriminatory laws. If states continue to violate the law and we are continually able to successfully sue them under Section 2, then they will become subjected to preclearance. And that's something that, given the rise of discriminatory laws and our success, we anticipate would be able to happen in Indian country.
And these sections of the law are important to protecting constitutional rights, correct?
That's right, yes.
We're the subcommittee on the Constitution, but we haven't really talked much about the Constitution. Some of our witnesses, I guess Ms. Frankenstein, talked about federal law in voting as though it were some novel or foreign idea that the Constitution or federal law should apply to voting in states alongside state law. But in fact, throughout our history, federal law, constitutional law, state law have coexisted side by side and in fact complemented each other, correct?
That's right. And what federal law does is it provides a backdrop, a backbone, really, of core constitutional rights and provides a forum for a vindication of those rights. And what we need is protection from bad state actors that violate the rights of Native Americans. Unfortunately, I think there's many more examples in my written testimony. State officials have failed their obligations at both the local and at the statewide level. They've acted with discrimination, and that has resulted in Native Americans being stripped of their right to vote. And so we need those federal protections in order to have our right to vote.
And is there anything about this concept of sovereignty or about the background of Native Americans that should entitle them to less protection constitutionally than others, regardless of race or background?
Absolutely not. Native Americans are American citizens. Native Americans are entitled to participate in American life, to pick politicians that will advocate for the structural changes that they need in their communities, and really vote on policies that will that reflect who they are. And really, sovereignty is not incompatible with participation in the American system. In fact, the best way to safeguard sovereignty in our federal system that has state and tribal governments is to participate. And so I think that the attempts to keep Native Americans from participating really are because of the fear of the Native Americans being able to flex political power.
President Nez, would you agree with what Ms. De Leon has just said?
Absolutely. Senator, Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member Cruz, members of the committee, we wholeheartedly agree with that comment. And the reason is I mentioned earlier trying to get information. We even had to file a lawsuit against the state and the counties, based on this treaty obligation between tribes and the federal government. There should be a trust responsibility by the federal government to protect the rights of indigenous peoples in this country. That's that responsibility. That's the agreement that we had when we agreed upon a treaty. And for the Navajo Nation, it was the Treaty of 1868, where we said to the federal government, if you're ever in trouble, USA, the Navajo people would be there, and vice versa. And I don't have to remind the committee here about a report, the Broken Promises report. To this day, the federal government has not fulfilled those promises that were said and put in place with that treaty. Now, you fast forward today, we're talking about elections, and I think we need this Native American Voting Rights Act between the federal government and the tribal governments, and without much influence from the state and the counties, to make sure that the right of indigenous peoples are protected. That is what we're asking today, and we're asking this Congress to be that champion to move that forward. And I appreciate the comments from everyone today, but all it comes down to is making sure that the Native people's right to vote stays in place for generations to come.
Now, President Nez, you made reference earlier to the Navajo language.
Yes.
And the role that it played in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
There are probably some members of the audience here or listening who don't know that story, right, and who don't know about the incredibly courageous performance of our Native Americans in our wars, in uniform, as public servants. Maybe you can just describe the role of that language in terms of enabling us to avoid the code breaking and surveillance of our enemies during World War II.
Well, thank you again, Chairman and Member Ranking Cruz and members of the committee. Let me just say, too, that Native Americans have contributed greatly to this country, the freedoms of this country. And for Navajo Nation in particular, the Navajo language is used in World War II as a code to win battles and to win the war. And we've heard from generals and leaders, even the presidents, say the same thing, that if it wasn't for the Navajo language, we would may have lost the war. And to say that the Navajo language shouldn't be utilized or be given to an elder at the polling location, to us, that's very hurtful and very disrespectful. And when our warriors, and I don't have to remind the committee of how Native Americans have volunteered in great numbers into the United States Armed Forces and volunteered to protect this country. And they kept that promise. When we signed a treaty, when the USA was ever in trouble, we would be there to back you up. And Senator and members of the committee, to this day, Native Americans have done just that. And I applaud the many warriors that have done great things and protected our freedoms here in the United States of America, and also to help protect our culture, tradition, and our language, and our right to vote.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have one last question, Ms. De Leon. We've heard some negative stuff here. Your report actually, I think, comments on the chilling effect of some of these false accusations on the willingness of Native Americans to come to the polls. Could you comment on that?
Thank you so much for that question, and just thank you so much, President Nez, for those thoughtful words. I think that what matters to Native Americans is the way that, when it comes to disenfranchisement, is the way that it's so pervasive. So not only do these laws make it difficult to vote, that difficulty also communicates to Native Americans that their vote is unwelcome. So if you have to travel to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to drop off a ballot and travel twice as far to cast your ballot in person, what's being communicated to you is that your vote doesn't matter and that you're not part of this system. You're not part of the American system. And so what we need is on-reservation polling places so that Native Americans can cast their ballot in places that they're comfortable with and familiar with, just like every other American. And so I think, that the Native American Voting Rights Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act go a long way to rectifying that continuing injustice.
Thank you. Before we close, I'd just like to enter into the record a letter from the civil rights organizations and Native American allies endorsing the Native American Voting Rights Act, a letter from tribal organizations endorsing the Native American Voting Rights Act, a letter from the Navajo Nation endorsing the Native American Voting Rights Act, all Pueblo Council of Governors resolutions supporting the Native American Voting Rights Act, the report that you just mentioned, obstacles at every turn, barriers to political participation faced by Native American voters, and an addendum that we have received without objection. I will place them in the record. If there are no further questions, we will keep the record open for a week in case any of my colleagues have additional comments, or if our witnesses want to supplement their responses. I think I've asked for some numbers from Mr. Buchanan, Secretary Buchanan, and Ms. Frankenstein. But we thank you for a very significant hearing. Again, apologies for beginning late. I've certainly learned a lot, and I think our colleagues will too from the testimony that you've given, and we thank you, especially in light of the distances that you have traveled, maybe not 4 time zones, but some of you 2 or 3, and again, our thanks. This concludes our hearing today. Thank you.